We've read a lot of family stories on revenge sins, but every so often there's one where the cruelty comes dressed as concern. Not loud, not messy, just careful enough that it can pass for love if you squint. Rachel Morgan built a life that finally felt solid, and still found herself being treated like a problem someone needed to manage. This is the way she remembers it. My phone buzzed while I was rinsing a coffee mug. One email, subject line neat and harmless, family reunion final details. I dried my hands on a dish towel and opened it standing at my kitchen island, still in a sweatshirt, still thinking about a product meeting in an hour. Rachel, the message began. After careful consideration, we don't think this year's reunion will be the best fit for you. Given how much your life has changed, you might feel uncomfortable with our simple weekend. We wouldn't want you to feel out of place, or for others to feel overshadowed. Overshadowed. The word sat there like it belonged in a business memo. My chest did that quiet drop it always does when my family turns me into a concept instead of a person. I reread the email once, then again. No insults, no yelling, just a clean little door closing. Sophie called as I was staring at the screen. My co-founder, my operator, the one who knew my face even when I didn't speak. "You're quiet," she noted. I got uninvited. I answered. My voice sounded normal, which made it worse. A pause. Forward it. I did. I waited. The house was still. The only sound was the refrigerator humming like nothing had changed. My phone buzzed again. A text this time from my cousin Jenna, the one who always tried to stay neutral until neutrality got too expensive. "Please don't show this to my mom," she wrote, "but you should see what Aunt Susan has been saying." An attachment followed, a screenshot of a family group thread. My mother's name appeared in the corner like a signature. "She's not unstable exactly," my mother had typed, "but Silicon Valley has amplified some tendencies, obsession, detachment. We've worried about her condition for years. We're trying to protect the family from an awkward weekend." I read it once. My throat tightened. I read it again, slower, like I could find a softer meaning if I looked hard enough. "We've worried about her condition." Sophie's voice came through my speaker, low and steady. "That's not concern. That's a story they tell so they don't have to admit they were wrong." From where we were sitting, it was the kind of line that didn't need emphasis. It just landed. I set my phone down and stared at the wood grain of the counter until my eyes stopped stinging. My company was in the middle of a Series C round. We were integrating legacy systems for banks and manufacturers who still ran parts of their business on software older than I was. I had built something real. Still, my mother could reduce me to a diagnosis she invented. I picked the phone back up and typed one sentence to Jenna. "I won't involve you. Thank you for telling me the truth." Then I texted Sophie. "Clear my afternoon. A beat. Already done. If you want more stories like this one, you can stay with us at Revenge Sins." I didn't know what I was about to do yet, but I knew one thing. They were not going to keep calling my mind a problem and still expect access to my life. The thing about being labeled early is that it sticks, even when nobody says it out loud anymore. At dinner, my parents didn't argue with me. They corrected me, softly, constantly. "Rachel, you don't have to explain it like that," my mother would say, smiling at my plate instead of my face. "You tend to get intense." My father would clear his throat, the sound meant to reset the room. "Your sister knows how to read people. Try watching how Allison handles conversations." Allison would offer a sympathetic look, the kind that said she was on my side while still being relieved she wasn't me. I learned early that silence was safer than enthusiasm. When I talked about building things, about code, about how systems talked to each other if you listened long enough, my parents exchanged glances. Not worried. Assessing. "Computers are fine as a hobby," my father once said while cutting his chicken. "But you don't want to trap yourself in something isolating." "I like it," I answered. My voice cracked on the word. My mother reached across the table and patted my wrist. Not a squeeze. A tap. "We know. Honey, We just worry you miss other parts of life. Other parts meant people, noise, small talk, all the things that drained me before I had words for it. At school, teachers praised my focus. At home, focus became fixation. When I stayed up late working on a project, my mother knocked on my door. "You've been in here a long time. Don't you think it's unhealthy to sit with a screen this much?" I looked at the half-finished interface on my laptop, the logic finally clicking into place. "I'm almost done." She smiled like she'd expected that answer. "That's what concerns us." My brother Mark got celebrated for his discipline. Early mornings, long study hours. No one asked if medicine was consuming him. Allison practiced arguments in the mirror. My parents called it ambition. When I did the same with a presentation, my father paused in the hallway. "You know you don't have to rehearse every word. People might think you're anxious." I nodded. I always nodded. There were no punishments, no yelling, just a steady adjustment of expectations until I learned to shrink myself into something easier to manage. At family gatherings, relatives asked polite questions. Still doing computer things, I answered carefully. Yes. My mother filled the silence. Rachel's always been very focused. Focused became the word they used when they didn't want to say something harsher. It followed me like a footnote. By the time I left for college, the story was already written. I was capable, but delicate, smart, but lacking balance. Someone who needed to be watched, guided, gently redirected. I believed it longer than I should have. It took years before I realized they weren't describing me. They were describing the version of me they could live with. Leaving home didn't feel dramatic. It felt administrative. A suitcase, a laptop backpack, my mother hovering near the door, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. "You'll call every week," she reminded me, smoothing the collar of my coat. Not a request, a condition. "I will." My father stood back, hands in his pockets. "Just remember," he added, "California has a way of burning people out. Pace yourself." I nodded, like I always did, the nod that kept conversations short. The first semester out west was louder than I expected. Not noise exactly, people, opinions, everyone certain they belonged where they were. I worked mornings at a campus cafe and nights in a computer lab that smelled like dust and burnt coffee. It wasn't glamorous. It was quiet in the way I needed. Money was always tight. Scholarships covered tuition. Everything else came from shifts and side contracts. When I called home, I kept it light. "I'm fine," I'd say. My mother's voice would soften. "You don't have to struggle just to prove something. I'm not proving anything." A pause. Then, "We just don't want you pushing yourself because of those tendencies." She always said it gently, like a diagnosis she'd rehearsed. I met Sophie during a late hackathon. She slid into the chair next to mine without asking and glanced at my screen. "You're solving the hard part first," she observed. "It's easier that way." She smiled, like I'd said something normal. "I'm Sophie." We didn't talk much that night. We worked. At dawn. She handed me a protein bar from her bag. "You forgot to eat." "So did you." Fair. After that, she kept showing up, not to fix me, just to build alongside me. When I told my family about a prototype I was working on, my father cleared his throat over the phone. "Just make sure you're not isolating yourself again." Sophie heard that one. She was sitting across from me on the floor. Wires everywhere. That again, she muttered once I hung up. I shrugged. "They worry." She leaned back against the couch. Worry usually sounds different. Distance didn't erase the pressure. It dulled it, made it manageable. I could breathe between calls. I could choose when to engage. By the time I graduated, home felt less like a place and more like a tone I'd learned to step out of. I didn't leave to be rebellious. I left because staying meant disappearing. Threadline didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with bugs, late nights, and a lot of coffee that went cold before I remembered it was there. Sophie and I worked out of a shared office with mismatched chairs and a whiteboard that never quite erased clean. Most days, progress looked like small wins, a workflow finally syncing, a COBOL-based mainframe finally talking to a modern cloud, API, quiet, technical victories. One afternoon, Sophie leaned back, her face illuminated by the glow of 3 monitors. The manufacturing client confirmed. They're moving the entire global integration to Threadline. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We didn't celebrate. We just nodded and kept working. We had built a bridge over a gap most companies were afraid to look at. The Series B funding round closed months later. The valuation was 9 figures, a number that felt heavy, carrying more responsibility and more eyes. When I shared the news during a visit home, my mother's response was a clinical pause. "That's wonderful, Rachel," she said, her voice laced with that familiar, practiced caution. "Just make sure you're not taking on too much. High pressure can trigger things." My father didn't look up from his paper. Rapid growth in Silicon Valley is often a bubble. It amplifies existing instabilities. "I'm managing fine," I said, my voice flat. At dinner, the atmosphere shifted when my brother Brian, the CPA, leaned in. He wasn't looking at me with pity. He was looking at me with a calculator in his mind. I read the sector report on Threadline. "Rachel," Brian said, swirling his wine, "you're solving the data silo problem for legacy banks, aren't you? Most firms lose 20% of their efficiency just trying to get their old systems to talk to new ones. If your mapping is as automated as they say, your margins must be insane." It was the first time a family member had spoken to me as a peer, not a patient. I felt a spark of hope. Exactly. We're liberating data that's been trapped for 30 years, but my mother quickly stepped in to reclaim the narrative. "It sounds very consuming. Brian, Rachel, I worry that this level of intensity is reinforcing those obsessive tendencies we saw when you were a child. You don't want to lose your balance." There it was, the concern-shaped cage. To them, my brilliance was just a symptom they needed to monitor. Later, Sophie listened as I replayed the night. "Brian sees the logic," I said, "but my parents only see the condition. They're clinging to a version of you that they can control," Sophie replied. "But legacy systems aren't the only things that refuse to upgrade." Rachel, sometimes, people choose to stay outdated too. The house wasn't a reward, it was logistics. After the secondary sale closed, I chose a hillside estate in Los Altos Hills, a structure of glass, steel, and exposed concrete. It was minimalist, intentional, and quiet. When my parents arrived, they stood in the grand entryway, looking not at the panoramic view of the valley, but at the lack of warmth. No family photos, no cluttered shelves of mementos, just clean lines and open space. "It's very stark, Rachel," my mother said, her voice echoing slightly off the polished stone floors. She ran a finger over a marble countertop as if searching for dust or a sign of life. "It feels more like an institution than a home." "It's efficient," I replied. "It removes distractions." My father didn't comment on the architecture. He just stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling tech campuses below. "Plenty of space to get lost in your own head," he muttered. The tension broke briefly in the home office. Brian stopped at the doorway, staring at the triple-monitor setup and the live data flow diagrams pinned to the glass wall. "Is this the global deployment map?" Brian asked, stepping closer. "You're monitoring the legacy handshakes in real time." "Legacy systems don't like surprises," I said. "They need constant, patient observation." Brian nodded, a look of genuine respect crossing his face. "Managing this level of complexity? It's impressive, Rachel. Most people would crumble under the technical debt." But my mother was already standing behind him, her smile tight. "That's exactly what worries us. Brian, look at this room. It's a cocoon. We've always seen how Rachel retreats when she's fixated. This environment just encourages that detachment. The word detachment hung in the air, clinical and cold. At dinner, the silence was heavy. No one mentioned the $7.2 million price tag or the achievement it represented. Instead, they spoke of Mark's hospital and Allison's cases. My home was treated like a symptom of my condition, a beautiful, expensive cage for a daughter they still believed was broken. When they left, my mother squeezed my arm. "Promise you'll come back to the real world occasionally." I watched their taillights disappear down the winding road. The house was smart. The lights dimmed automatically to my preferred setting. It worked perfectly. But for the first time, the air felt tight. Not because I was failing, but because I had succeeded, and they hated that they couldn't claim credit for the cure. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a calendar reminder and a client update. Family reunion final details. I opened it without thinking much. I was half listening to Sophie talk through a deployment timeline, nodding while my eyes scanned the screen. "Rachel," it began. "After careful consideration, we feel this year's reunion may not be the best fit for you. With how much your life has changed, we worry the weekend might feel uncomfortable. We want everyone to relax and enjoy themselves." I stopped nodding. Sophie noticed. "What's wrong?" I turned my laptop toward her. She read silently, jaw tightening a fraction. "They're uninviting you," she said. Not angry, just precise. "They're being considerate." I replied automatically. The words came out before I could stop them. She looked at me for a long moment. "That's not what this is." I reread the email. No accusations, no conflict, just a clean exclusion wrapped in courtesy. I closed the laptop and stared at the table. My phone buzzed a few minutes later. A text from my cousin Jenna. "Please don't mention me, but I think you should see this." A screenshot followed. It was a family group chat, names stacked along the side. My mother's message highlighted in gray. "She's not unstable exactly." My mother had written, "But Silicon Valley amplified some tendencies. Obsession, detachment. We've worried about her condition for years. We don't want it to dominate the weekend." My throat tightened. Condition. The word felt clinical, like something entered into a chart. Sophie leaned closer, reading over my shoulder. She exhaled slowly. "They didn't just exclude you. They justified it." I nodded. The room felt quieter than it had a moment before. Another message from my mother sat below the first. "This is about protecting family dynamics, not punishment. Protecting." From me. I typed back to Jenna carefully. "Thank you for telling me. I won't involve you." She responded almost immediately. "I'm sorry. I didn't know she talked about you like that. Neither did I. Not in writing. Not this plainly." Sophie pushed her chair back. "They didn't doubt your career. They questioned your mind." I swallowed. The words landed because they were true. I thought about every conversation that ended with concern, every reminder to slow down, every gentle warning disguised as care. "I'm not going to argue with them," I said finally. Sophie tilted her head. "Then what are you going to do?" I picked up my phone again. Not rushing this time. "I'm going to stop letting them decide where I belong." She didn't smile. She nodded. Outside, a delivery truck passed. Normal sounds. Normal day. Nothing had shifted on the surface, but something had changed underneath. They had drawn a line, and for the first time, I was ready to decide what stood on my side of it. I didn't announce a war. I just started making calls. Sophie watched me pace the living room, barefoot on the cold stone. "You're doing this quietly," she noted. "If I'm loud, I'm manic. If I'm quiet, I'm detaching." I said, looking at the guest list. "So I'm going to be professional?" The list included the people who knew me before my mother had polished her story, the cousins I used to code with, the aunts who remembered my curiosity before it was labeled an obsession. I sent the invitations myself. Short, direct. Some are gathering at my home in Los Altos Hills. All travel and 5-star accommodations at the nearby garden court are covered. We'd love to see you. Attached was the Forbes profile on Threadline. Not as a boast, but as a correction. It spoke of emotional discipline and unwavering focus as my greatest assets. I was letting the world's most reputable business journalists provide the counter-narrative to my mother's private emails. I'm not defending myself, I told Sophie as I hit send. I'm providing data. Responses flooded in. My cousin Mark, the one my mother said I overshadowed, replied within minutes. Didn't realize the scale of Threadline. Rachel, Mom said you were struggling with the pressure. But this looks like a win. I'm in. The realization hit me. They weren't staying away from me because they were uncomfortable. They were staying away because they had been told I was unwell. A few days later, Uncle Robert called. His voice was stiff. This overlaps with the Lake Geneva reunion. Rachel, people are jumping ship. They're curious. They have a choice. Robert, your parents are devastated. They think you're doing this out of spite. They're worried about your mental state, given the escalation. I'm hosting a dinner, not a coup, I replied evenly. And if they show up, tell security to let them in. I'm not hiding anymore. The week before the gathering was a blur of logistics. No gold-plated excess, just intentional comfort. As I watched the staff set up the terrace, Sophie handed me a glass of water. The facts are already in the room. Rachel, she said, tomorrow, you don't have to prove you're successful. You just have to prove you're whole. People arrived in waves. There was no grand announcement, just the low hum of luxury cars on gravel and the brightening of voices as they crossed the patio. I stayed near the periphery, playing the host, letting the house and the atmosphere do the talking. Sophie moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of someone who had helped build this empire. I caught fragments of conversation as I passed groups of cousins and uncles. I looked up Threadline's Series C. I heard a younger cousin whisper, "The tech stack is revolutionary. She isn't just doing computers, she's rewriting how infrastructure works." A man I recognized as a lead architect from an early client engagement was speaking to my Uncle Robert. Rachel's discipline is legendary in the Valley, he said. Her ability to stay calm under system-wide failures saved our firm millions. She's the steadiest founder I've ever worked with. I watched Robert's face. The unstable narrative he had been fed was visibly evaporating. Then, my parents appeared. They didn't come through the gate like guests. They marched in like inspectors. My mother, Susan, kept her posture rigid, her worried smile fixed in place. My father, David, scanned the terrace as if looking for evidence of a breakdown. The familiar tightening in my chest began, but Sophie was there instantly. "They're here," she said, her voice a grounding anchor. "And you are in your own house. Rachel." My mother approached first. "Rachel, we saw the cars. We heard everyone was here instead of Lake Geneva." "Welcome, Mom," I said, my voice steady. My father folded his arms, looking at the infinity pool and the sleek, modern lines of the estate. "This isn't healthy, Rachel. It's an overcompensation. No normal life looks like this." "David," my mother murmured, though her eyes remained on me, sharp and assessing. "We're just concerned, honey. This environment, the pressure of this Series C. We've seen how it intensifies your tendencies, the obsession, the detachment." The word tendencies hit the air like a foul scent. This time, I didn't flinch. I didn't nod to keep the peace. "You didn't doubt my career," I said, holding her gaze until she looked away. "That's not fair," she snapped. "We only wanted—" "You pathologized my mind so you wouldn't have to admit you were wrong about me." The conversation around us dipped. The silence wasn't total, but it was enough. My father scoffed, his face reddening. "We raised concerns. That's parental duty, not pathology. You labeled my focus as obsession I continued, my voice gaining a calm, terrifying clarity. You called my discipline an imbalance. You reframed my independence as a condition so you could feel superior while I was succeeding. We were trying to help, my mother insisted, her voice rising into a thin, brittle register. Sophie stepped forward. She didn't shout. She simply occupied the space between them. That is enough. You do not get to diagnose a CEO at her own table. You do not get to call her unstable in a room full of people who respect her brilliance. You don't understand our family dynamics. My father growled. I understand boundaries, Sophie replied. I looked at my parents, really looked at them. They seemed small against the backdrop of the life I had built. I didn't invite you here to argue, I said. But the door is closed. You don't get access to my life while you call my mind a problem. Rachel, you're overreacting, my mother pleaded, reaching for my arm. No, I answered. I'm finally reacting correctly. They didn't leave immediately, but they were no longer the center of the room. They stood there, ghosts of a story that no longer fit the reality of the woman standing before them. The truth had stood up, and for the first time, they had nothing to say back. By the time the last car pulled away, the house sounded different, not empty, just settled. I stacked a few plates in the sink, rinsed them without hurrying. Sophie sat at the counter, scrolling through messages she hadn't answered yet. They'll talk about this for years, she said, not looking up. I know. She waited, then added, You okay? I leaned against the counter and thought about it. Not the party. Not my parents' faces. The quiet that came after. I don't feel lighter. I said, But I feel done. She nodded, like that made perfect sense. That's usually how it starts. We didn't rehash anything. There was nothing left to explain. Sophie left not long after, squeezing my shoulder on her way out. No speeches. No reassurance. Just presence. The next morning, the house held the sunlight differently, softer. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and opened my laptop. There were emails from relatives. Thank yous. A few awkward apologies on behalf of other people. I read them slowly, then closed the inbox. My parents didn't reach out right away. When they eventually did, weeks later, it was careful, measured, asking if I'd be open to talking with a mediator. I agreed, not because I owed them access, because I finally trusted myself to set terms. What surprised me wasn't the conversation. It was how little it rearranged me. For most of my life, I'd been bracing for their approval like it was a finish line, something that would mean I'd arrived, standing in my own kitchen, alone and steady. I realized I'd already crossed it without them. Rachel Morgan didn't need to be corrected anymore, or translated, or softened. I kept building. I kept choosing people who didn't need me to be smaller to stay comfortable. If this story stays with you, you're welcome to stay with us at Revenge Sins. Some endings aren't loud. They just finally feel like your own.